Well, hi, and it's nice to be with you once again. We're going to just look at the first few verses of Acts chapter 18, which really centre around the city of Corinth. We find in verse 1 of chapter 18 that it says that after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. And then in verse 2, we find that he finds a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, which is up in northern Turkey on the Black Sea, and his name's Aquila, and he'd come to Corinth from Italy. And so Aquila, and it says with his wife Priscilla, they'd also come to Corinth. And the question really that we want to ask ourselves is why? Why did they come to Corinth? And after what things did Paul come from Athens to Corinth? What brought him? What drew him down into Corinth? And what brought Aquila and Priscilla down into Corinth? Because what's going to happen is in the scriptures, these three, through the providence of God, are going to be brought together in the most profound and most remarkable way. And together those three are going to change the destiny of the whole Gentile world. And it's a remarkable story that is first introduced to us here in Acts chapter 18. And we have Corinth mentioned for the first time. First time in the New Testament, here in verse 1 of chapter 18. And when we think about Corinth and we look at Corinth and we see where it is geographically in the world, it's quite interesting to see that Corinth was right on the precipice of what's called an isthmus, which is a land bridge. And when you look at a map of Greece, and you see that the southern part of Greece is almost like an island, and it's just joined by this little land bridge called an isthmus. And so the southern part of Greece is called the Peloponnese, and then you have this isthmus. But in the days of Paul, this whole area, right from the very southern tip, right up past the isthmus, and then on to Athens and beyond Athens, was called the province of Achaia. It was the province of Achaia within the Roman Empire. And what used to happen is in those first century biblical days is this little isthmus, which was 4 miles wide from east to west. 4 miles or 6 kilometers. On the east side, you had a port city called Centuria. And on the west side, just 6 kilometers away, you had a port city called Latium, which is on the west side. And what used to happen in those days is that because the southern tip of Greece, this Peloponnese, because the coastline was so dangerous, that the ships used to come from the east side, from what we know as Turkey, but in those days it was Asia Minor. They used to come from that area or from Israel. They used to come up and they would come to Centuria. Or if they were coming from the other side, if they were coming from Rome and from Italy, they would come to Lentium. And when they got to those ports, what the Romans did was the Romans built a stone road between both ports, between east and west. And they built a stone channel 6 kilometers long. And what they used to do was they used to unload the ships at either side of the docks. And so they would unload all the cargo from the ships. If the ship was a small ship, what they would do is they'd transport the cargo from one side to the other, and then they would drag the ships on logs from one side to the other, and then drop it in the port on the opposite side, and then reload its cargo, and off they would go. If the ship was a larger ship, they would unload the cargo, and then they'd send the large ship around the dangerous coastline of the Peloponnese, of Greece. And then if by misfortune the ship hit rocks and sunk, they didn't lose all their valuable cargo. and the idea was that then when they got to the other side, they would then load all their cargo up. It was a very treacherous area down in the southern tip of Greece. And so this isthmus and these two little ports with the major city of Corinth sitting right there, it was like the centre of the whole Roman Empire, even though Rome was its capital. Rome was the biggest city in the Roman Empire in that day. Alexandria down in Egypt was the second largest, and Corinth was the third largest city. About 80 kilometres away was Athens. Athens was a white-collar city. It was full of universities and intelligentsia, and it was full of all the noblemen of Greece, all the learned, all the educated, all the people that were reading and developing themselves. But down in Corinth, 80 kilometres away, was a blue-collar, working-class city with 200,000 people. Athens only had about 50,000, 40,000 people in it. And so this isthmus became the centrepiece of everything that was going on. And sailors and tradesmen and things like that would all come to this centre point. In fact, what happened was Julius Caesar in his day saw the value of this little isthmus, and he decided that what he would do is he'd build a canal. And he was unsuccessful because the rock is just so hard to dig through. And it took nearly 2,000 years before eventually in the 1800s a canal was dug and constructed from one side of the isthmus to the other. And that canal is used today. And it's amazing to watch the ships pass up and down through this canal that has so much history associated with it. But the question is, well, why did the Apostle Paul come from Athens? And why did Aquila and Priscilla come from Rome to this city? Because this city, as big and grand as it was the most immoral city in the world, in the known world. It was the equivalent of the Las Vegas of today. And so people came to this city for a variety of reasons. One of the major reasons that this city, which had previously been destroyed in the year 140 BC, but in around 40 BC, the Caesars rebuilt the city and it became a flourishing city. But it was a very different city to the old city. The old city had its aristocracy. It had its noblemen and its noble women. But they'd all been either killed or had fled for their lives. And now this new flourishing city that was only about 80 years old, maybe 90 years old at the time of Paul and Aquila and Priscilla, this was now a city of self-made millionaires. This was like a gold rush town. And people were flocking to it from four corners of the known world to make their fortune. And so blue-collar workers were coming with their trades, with their ideas, and they were making their fortune. And one of the huge attractions for this city was its pagan worship. On every street corner there was a temple. It was like on every street corner there was a McDonald's store. There were temples everywhere for everything, and they were obscene and immoral. But the most immoral was the temple at the top of the Corinth. The Corinth is the Acropolis of Corinth. We've heard of the Acropolis in Athens. Well, this is the Acropolis of Corinth. And many of the cities through Europe have acropolises. There's another Acropolis in Sardis when we think about the seven ecclesias or the seven churches of Revelation. And so these acropolises are mountain fortresses. And if you travel particularly through Europe, that all the castles and all the fortresses are built on the tops of the hill. And so on the top of this Acropolis in Corinth was built the most famous temple. And it was there because a part of the idea of the Acropolis was that in the time of an invasion, that the people would run inside the walls. And so Corinth was a well-fortified city. It had 2 great walls built around it at the base of the mountain. So it was easily defendable. And inside the Acropolis, and inside that area, they could farm. And they had natural spring waters and natural water catchment areas. So it was a place where you could survive for years if there was a siege taking place. And the crown, or the jewel of the crown of this Acropolis, was the temple of Aphrodite. And that temple had as part of its service 1,000 priestesses and priests. And basically they served as prostitutes, both male and female. So you would go there for a religious service and have your way with the men and the women acting as priests and priestesses of the temple. And that was Aphrodite's right there, the centerpiece of this city. And today when you go there, there's nothing left of that particular temple. There's just a few stones and a few ruins laying around, because when it's been destroyed at different stages through attacks and through earthquakes, the ruins of the city, the ruins of the temple have been used for other parts of fortification. But what does remain at the base of the Aquila Corinth, in the remains of the ancient city of Corinth, that you can walk around today, and you can walk up and down the streets and see all the different sites, and you can visit the theatres and the synagogues and the streets and the shops and the bars, and all those places are still there, or the streets and the layouts and the ruins are still there. And the crucial part that you see today is you see the temple of Apollos. The temple of Apollos. And that temple still has 7 pillars remaining from its original heyday back in the time of Paul and Aquila and Priscilla. And so the question is, well, why would Paul and why would Aquila and Priscilla, who is a Jewish man, we're told in Acts chapter 18 and verse 2 that Aquila is a certain Jew. So why would a man with a certain Jew, we believe that Priscilla, his wife, we'll talk about her in another session, but she's most likely converted to Judaism. So why would they come to such a city? And why would Paul come down into Corinth? Because what had happened with Paul is he'd been called from the area of Turkey, Asia Minor, where he was visiting the cities and the towns that he'd preached in his first missionary journey. He was visiting those places, and then he came to a crossroad moment as to, well, now that I've been back to Antioch, Priscilla, and now that I've been back to Derbe and to Iconium and to Lystra, am I going to go north towards the Black Sea, or am I going to go south down to Ephesus? And it seems to be in the cross thoughts of that moment of his mind that Paul gets that vision of an invitation by the man from Macedonia to come across to Europe, come across the Aegean Sea, come across that area that we know today, the Greek islands, come across from there and come and help us. And some commentators suggest that man was Luke, because the record changes very quickly, because up until that stage, Luke is writing that Paul went here and Paul went there. And when that vision appears to him, he says, and then we went across and they crossed the ocean and went to Philippi. And so Paul now, upon that invitation from the man from Macedonia, crosses over into Philippi. And he has quite some success there. He obviously meets Lydia there and baptizes Lydia and establishes a little ecclesia there in Philippi. And of course he gets beaten up and thrown into prison with Silas, and all those things happen with the fortune-telling lady, and all those things happen, and he gets run out of town because he's healing people and doing miraculous things and changing the lifestyle of the Jews and the aristocracy. And so he gets run out of town with his life being threatened, and he makes his way with Silas, and they come to Thessalonica on the coastline. And so they're on the coastline at Thessalonica, and again Paul goes and he starts preaching, and he starts to have some moderate success. And again the Jews rise up against him, and they persecute him, and they run him out of town again. And so off they go, and with their tail between their legs, they head up inland into the area of Berea. And now they're at Berea, and the Berean people are really interested in the things of God and what the message that Paul is preaching. And the Jews down in Thessalonica, they hear that Paul's now up in Berea, so they run up to Berea and they stir up everybody, cause a whole lot of trouble, threaten Paul's life, and off goes Paul again, and they take him down to Athens. And he's in Athens now, and of course, we're familiar with the familiar story of Mars Hill and how Paul preaches about all their idol worshipping and how they have this idol to the unknown God. And Paul explains that unknown God, that's the God of Israel. That's the God of the universe. And he explains that to them. And again, he has some moderate success because although he doesn't have a conversion, from the record, there are those that said, that's all really fascinating and interesting. Can we hear some more from you? And so Paul doesn't actually suffer any persecution in Athens. It's the first time in months that he's not been driven out of town. It's the first time in ages that he hasn't suffered any persecution. And yet he still leaves Athens and he comes down to Corinth. Why is the question? Why would you leave a place where you weren't being persecuted and come down into Corinth, into Sin City, as it were? And as I say, there's all this pagan, idolatrous worship taking place. But there are other things happening. Because what we're told is in Acts chapter 18 and in verse 3 that both Paul and Aquila are tent makers. So they're both of the same trade. What we know is that in Jewish families, Jewish boys all had to learn a trade. It didn't matter what their position in life was. It didn't matter whether they're going to be a lawyer or a teacher or a part of the intelligentsia or a Pharisee. It didn't matter what your future held for you. You had to learn a trade just in case you fell on hard times and had to earn a living. And so miraculously, through the providence of God, we have Paul down in Tarsus on the Mediterranean Sea learning a trade of tent making. And 1,000 kilometres to the north, on the coastline of the Black Sea, you have a man called called Aquila, who's learning a tent making trade. And these two men are going to move all around Asia Minor, and eventually Aquila's going to make his way to Europe, and then Paul's going to come across to Europe, and they're going to both make their way, and they're both going to be drawn down into Corinth. And the question is, why? Why are they both being drawn down into Corinth? And what God, through his providence, is going to do is he's going to change the world. The purpose of God in bringing these people together was that he's going to change the destiny of the world for the Gentiles. Because there's going to come a crossroad in Paul's moments of his life here where he's going to turn his back on the Jews finally. Having been persecuted, ran out of town, beaten, stoned, he turns his back on them and says, I'm going to turn to the Gentiles. And he does that with Aquila and Priscilla right here in Corinth. Of all the places that God chooses, he chooses Corinth to turn to the Gentiles, to turn to you and to me. But what drew Aquila and Priscilla? We can see what's happening with Paul's life there through Acts chapter 17. What drew Aquila and Priscilla? And of course, they were tent makers, as I said. And it would appear that Aquila was quite the entrepreneurial type, quite clever. He had a house in Rome. He's going to now have a house in Corinth. He's going to move to Ephesus eventually with his wife. He's going to have another house there. And then he's going to eventually move back to Rome again and get another house there. So he's obviously a very capable businessman, entrepreneurial and skillful. So when he's driven out of town, we are told, because of an edict, because of a command by Claudius the emperor, who declares that all Jews have got to leave Rome, suddenly Aquila and Priscilla are thrown out of Rome and they've got to find their way to a new city. And we could ask ourselves, well, why didn't he turn and go back to Pontus? Why not return to his home city? Or better still, he's a Jew. Why not go to Jerusalem or at least Galilee and be with men and women of fellow thought and fellow mind? Or if he's so successful, why not even go to Alexandria, the second greatest city? He was in the greatest city. Why not go to the second greatest city? Why go to Corinth? And the attraction with Corinth was that Corinth had what is called the Isthmus Games. On this little neck of water, they had the Isthmus Games. Now, the Olympic Games were held every 4 years. And of course, they were the most famous games and are still famous to this day. But what used to happen is every other year, every second year, they would have the Isthmus Games, a little bit like we have the Commonwealth Games in the Commonwealth nations around the world. Well, they had the Isthmus Games, and they were held every second year. And every second year, the people would come to the city of Corinth. The athletes would come, the carnivals would come, the tourists would come, the manufacturers would come. And of course, all of these people needed to find accommodation. And although Corinth was a large, prosperous city, and it had a lot of permanent residents, and it had a lot of hotels and places for people to stay, at the time of the games in particular, and some of the festive pagan feasts, the town would swell and double in size, and tents were the accommodation of the day. And of course, just like you see in expos and Olympic Games today, people don't arrive just the day or the week before the games. They arrive the month before or 2 months before, and they stay for a month after. So it's a big period of time that lasts for 4 or 5 months. And so tourist season was huge in Corinth, both preparing for these events, living through them, maintaining tents, repairing them as different aspects happen, as the winds blow and as things happen, maintenance is required, and then of course packing up and moving on. And so it was the perfect place for an entrepreneur, the perfect place for a businessman to come with all the other businessmen and all the other trades and everything else that was going on in this area. So it was the perfect place for a Jewish man, because at this stage in the story, I don't believe that Aquila and Priscilla have been baptized. They have not yet met Paul, and I believe that it's going to be Paul who's going to convert them, because what he's going to do is he's going to meet them, and they're going to have this relationship through their skills, through their trades, and Aquila and Priscilla are going to be introduced to the true word of God, to the gospel message through Paul in Corinth. And as I say, they are destined to change the world. These three are going to come together, and they're going to change the destiny of the Gentile world. And so we'll deal with that aspect and this amazing couple, this beautiful couple, in the next session. So until then, God be with you. God bless you. Take care. Bye for now. Amen.